Hi, I'm Mr. New Jersey. This is the sixth installment of a multi-part crash course in New Jersey government and politics. If you haven't already, you should watch the previous videos of this series before watching this one, because these videos are designed to build off one another, and I will not be repeating information. Today, we will discuss how New Jersey's state legislative and congressional districts are drawn. We will define gerrymandering and go over some of the most common gerrymandering strategies. Then we will discuss what might replace gerrymandering and some of the non-gerrymandering related factors that mapmakers might keep in mind. And finally, we will examine New Jersey's 2010 redistricting as a case study for all of the concepts we've talked about. I will put timestamps in the video description so you can jump to whatever topic interests you. Let's get started. Following every decennial United States Census, New Jersey's congressional and legislative districts are redrawn to reflect changes in how the population is located, has grown, or has shrunk over the preceding decade, such that each legislative district has an approximately equal population, and each congressional district has an approximately equal population. The number of legislative districts is always the same, 40. But the number of congressional districts New Jersey has might change after any given census, according to how New Jersey's share of the total U.S. population has changed. For example, between the 2000 census and the 2010 census, New Jersey's population grew, but not as fast as the total U.S. population grew. As a result, New Jersey's share of the total U.S. population had shrunk enough to have New Jersey lose one of its congressional districts, going from 13 districts down to 12. In most U.S. states, legislative and congressional districts are simply drawn by the state's legislature and signed by the state's governor, just like any other legislation. In New Jersey, however, the legislative and congressional maps are each drawn by separate bipartisan commissions. The legislative districts are drawn by the New Jersey Apportionment Commission. The commission has 10 members. The state chairpeople of the two political parties whose candidates received the highest numbers of votes in the previous gubernatorial election get to appoint 5 of the members apiece. For practical purposes, this means that the Democratic and Republican parties always get to appoint 5 members apiece. The New Jersey Constitution specifies that the chairpeople should try to appoint members from various geographic areas of the state. The aim of this provision is to ensure no region feels left out of the districting process. A deadline exists by which time the Commission must draft and approve, by majority vote, a map of legislative districts. If the Commission fails to approve a map in the allotted time, which often occurs when the two political parties propose their own maps and tie when voting on them, the Chief Justice of New Jersey's Supreme Court gets to appoint an 11th member of the Commission who is expected to break the tie. New Jersey's congressional districting process is fairly similar to its legislative districting process. It is handled by the New Jersey Redistricting Commission, which has 13 members. None of the members of the Commission are allowed to be members of, or hold jobs attached to, the U.S. Congress. 2 members apiece are appointed by New Jersey Senate President, General Assembly Speaker, the minority party leaders from each house of the state legislature, and the chairpeople of the two political parties that received the 2 highest numbers of votes in the previous gubernatorial election. The New Jersey Constitution asks that the people who make appointments to the Commission consider geographic, ethnic, and racial diversity when doing so. Analyze the people who make the appointments, and you'll see that, for practical purposes, the Commission always winds up with 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. These 12 members then vote to appoint someone who must have been a New Jersey resident for at least 5 years, and may not have held political or partisan office during that period, to be the Commission's 13th independent member and a chairperson. If the Commission does not choose anyone to be the 13th member before a set deadline, then the names of the candidates for the independent membership who received the 2 highest numbers of votes are sent to the New Jersey Supreme Court to be decided between by a majority vote of the justices. The New Jersey Constitution says that the justices should make this vote based on each candidate's education, experience, history of public service, and perceived ability to represent the interests of the state rather than partisan interests. The New Jersey Constitution demands that the Commission hold at least 3 public hearings across the state. The Commission must then decide on a map. If the Commission fails to approve a map by majority vote before a set deadline, the justices of the New Jersey Supreme Court vote to choose between the 2 maps that received the largest numbers of votes, but at least 5 votes, in the Redistricting Commission. The New Jersey Constitution says that the justices should make their decision based on which map more closely adheres to federal laws and the United States Constitution. A noteworthy difference between the state legislative districting process and the congressional districting process is what federal courts have to say about how close the populations of each district have to be. The U.S. Supreme Court has determined that based on the U.S. Constitution, every person's vote should have equal weight in state and congressional voting. As a result, the Supreme Court demands that all districts must have roughly the same populations. However, the Supreme Court has generally been much more strict with the equal population rule when it comes to congressional districts as compared to state legislative districts. Congressional districts generally have to have almost exactly the same population, with only very small deviations allowed. By contrast, state legislative districts generally only have to be within about 10% of each other in terms of population. This allows state governments more room in determining what districting formulas they want to use for their state legislative districts. One of the ways New Jersey has taken advantage of this leeway is that the New Jersey Apportionment Commission is able to avoid breaking up most of the municipalities. Thus, while New Jersey's congressional districts do a better job in terms of having equal population per district, New Jersey's state legislative districts do a better job in terms of not breaking up towns and cities. So, to simplify everything we just covered, the commissions that draw New Jersey's legislative and congressional districts are designed to have half Democrats, half Republicans, and usually one additional member not particularly affiliated with either party who breaks the tie when the 2 parties almost inevitably can't agree on a map by themselves. Now we will discuss gerrymandering, which is when map makers draw a map in such a way as to benefit a particular political party. The most common gerrymandering strategies are packing and cracking. Packing means that you intentionally put as many members of the political party you oppose as you can into as few districts as you can. This effectively restricts the power of your opponent party to just a few districts, giving your party an advantage in the remaining districts. Cracking refers to putting a few members of the political party you oppose into a district with a larger number of the members of the political party you support, which will result in the opposing party members being outweighed by your own. Typically, both packing and cracking will be used for different districts within the same map, such that you would pack some members of the opposing party and crack the rest. The map on screen is an example of how packing and cracking work. Just under 2/3 of the voters support the purple party. So if this map was drawn fairly, you would probably expect 2 of the 3 districts to elect purple party candidates. However, this map was drawn to benefit the orange party. Most of the purple party voters are packed into the district at the top of the screen, while the remaining purple party voters are cracked between the districts at the bottom of the screen. So based on this map, you would expect the purple party to only win 1 of the districts, and the orange party to win 2 of them. Unfortunately, throughout much of U.S. history, cracking has been specifically implemented to try to diminish the power of racial and ethnic minority groups. A map demonstrating this can be seen on screen, where a hypothetical state's African American community has been cracked between 3 majority white districts. In response to this, one of the ways that some states, including New Jersey, have tried to counter this trend is by creating districts in which particular minority groups are the majority. States may even pursue this goal at the expense of compactness or of keeping municipalities together. However, some people have a perspective that this sort of districting is actually pernicious for the communities involved, which is that even if they're well-intentioned, They are in fact examples of institutionalized packing of these communities, such that even though with these districts the communities have at least one representative guaranteed, if each community was split between multiple different districts, even though the communities wouldn't be guaranteed to get at least one representative favorable to them, they would each have the opportunity to get more than one representative favorable to them. I'm not going to tell you that one of these perspectives is right or wrong, because the line between protecting communities from cracking and institutionally packing them is very, very blurry. But I just wanted to introduce you to both of those perspectives. Now we'll talk about gerrymandering strategies that revolve around helping or hurting specific candidates within a state. A particularly common strategy is to draw an incumbent or candidate you don't like into a hostile district. For example, if there's a candidate you don't like, you could make a district primarily including members of the other political party, and then draw the house of the candidate you don't like into that district. The map on screen, which is drawn to benefit the Orange Party, demonstrates this strategy, since the Orange Party drew purple candidate C into a majority orange district. Now, candidate C is stuck with a difficult choice between running for re-election in their current district and probably losing, or going through the process of moving to a different district where they'll have a better chance. Another gerrymandering strategy is to draw candidates you do like into favorable districts. This can allow you to protect the candidates you like, even if they live in areas that are predominantly inhabited by members of the other political party. The example map on screen shows the Orange Party trying to benefit an orange candidate in the top right by connecting the candidate to an orange district in the bottom left. This allows the orange candidate to face favorable voters in an area that's not quite where they live, rather than face the hostile voters in the area where they live. One additional candidate-based gerrymandering strategy that's fairly common is to draw multiple candidates you don't like into a single district so that only one of them can potentially be elected, unless one of them moves. For instance, the map on screen is drawn to benefit the Purple Party, and the incumbents in each district are labeled with an I next to them. But then the census rolls around, and the Orange Party gets to redraw the map. So they draw the lines in such a way as to put all of the purple incumbents into the same district. Now that we've discussed gerrymandering in general, we'll discuss why New Jersey's districting processes don't prevent it. Why is taking districting power out of the state legislature's hands and giving it to the bipartisan commissions we have not enough to prevent gerrymandering? The simple answer is that oftentimes, instead of working together to draw a compromise map, the Democrats and the Republicans on each commission go off and to draw their own gerrymandered maps, then come back and to try to persuade the tie-breaking member of the commission to choose theirs. Occasionally there will be districting cycles where the two parties actually do work together to make a compromise map, but such cooperation is by no means guaranteed. However, don't assume that the safeguards New Jersey has in place are completely useless. In fact, they have two noticeable benefits that make New Jersey less gerrymandered than many other states. Firstly, the fact that we use commissions whose partisan makeup isn't generally dependent on which party controls the state government makes it harder for one party to hold their version of a gerrymander in place indefinitely. Secondly, the tie-breaking member often does truly have good intentions and not want the map to be gerrymandered. And since the tie-breaking member usually gets to choose the map in the end, even though the parties draw gerrymandered maps, the parties often make the gerrymandering less extreme in order to appeal to the tie-breaking member. Now we will discuss what a world without gerrymandering might look like, which is a fairly complex question. One aspect of this complexity is institutional reforms themselves that could incentivize the map makers to not draw based on partisan advantage, such as using a mathematical formula to draw districts, or using a commission of entirely independents to draw districts. But these aren't even the complexities I want to focus on. The more fundamental complexity is deciding as a society what values we want our maps to reflect. And there are multiple options to choose from, some of which directly conflict. Now, you might be sitting there asking yourself, why do we even need to have a conversation about what comes after gerrymandering in a video about how districting actually works, which is currently based on gerrymandering? Well, this discussion actually is relevant to how districting is done today, because the independent member on each commission often does have to work through these decisions in their own mind. See, when the independent member tries to pressure the members of each party to not gerrymander, rather than just say, don't gerrymander, they often pick specific values that they want in its place. And oftentimes, even though maps remain somewhat gerrymandered, the map that comes closer to the values that the independent member chose is the one that the independent member picks. Additionally, the partisan members on the commissions aren't totally evil. To some extent, they certainly want to benefit their own party, but to the extent that they do want to be sort of fair, they may work through some of these decisions in their own minds as well. With that disclaimer out of the way, recall that we were just talking about how a post-gerrymandering world can be complex because the values you might want to replace gerrymandering with can conflict. Here's a simple example. A lot of people say that once gerrymandering is abolished, the goal should be to make districts as competitive as possible. The argument being, competitiveness increases the accountability of legislators to their constituents by forcing them to face tougher re-elections every year. Furthermore, competitiveness in elections is known to drive up turnout. So the more people feel like the election is actually going to make a difference, the more likely they are to show up. On the other hand, some people say that once gerrymandering is gone, the goal should be to protect incumbents as much as possible. There are two main arguments for this perspective. One is that if people's incumbents stay the same for a long amount of time, people will get to know who their incumbent is, what they stand for, and how to interact with them. Whereas if people's incumbents change constantly, they might lose track of who their incumbents are and decide to disengage from politics. And secondly, particularly for congressional redistricting, it may be good to protect incumbents because that builds up seniority for them and allows them to get better benefits for the state. Needless to say, protecting incumbents and creating competitive districts directly conflict. Here's another example. Some people say that the most fair way to do districting is to try to make sure that the percentage of districts won by each party reflects the percentage of each party in the state. So, for instance, if there's a state where 3/4 of the people support the purple party and 1/4 support the orange party, if this state had 4 congressional districts, you would want the purple party to have an advantage in 3 of them and the orange party to have an advantage in 1. On the other hand, some people say that the best way to do districting is to make all of the districts as compact as possible. This means there will generally be shorter driving times for constituents trying to get from one side of the district to the other, or from their house to their representative's district office. It also means that we get rid of the goofy-looking lines on maps that everybody associates with gerrymandering. And finally, having compact districts, where you're generally in the same district as the people who live near you, might help foster a sense of community within the district. As the maps I've had on screen demonstrate, however, designing districts to be the same percentages within the state as parties, and designing districts to be compact have the potential to conflict. And of course, either of these two values could conflict with either of the values from the previous example. A final potential point to be aware of is that sometimes some of the values I've talked about might inadvertently end up benefiting a particular party. So for example, if you decide that the value you want is protecting incumbents, what if the majority of the incumbents come from the same political party? Could this be considered de facto gerrymandering? A final value that I want to mention before moving on from this section of the video, which of course can conflict with any of the values we already talked about, is protecting communities of interest. We've already discussed racial communities of interest during the gerrymandering section of the video, but it's important to note that there are other types of communities of interest as well that mapmakers may or may not decide to keep in mind. So for example, regions can be communities of interest, because there are often specific political issues facing specific regions. And many people would say that keeping regions together in region-based districts, rather than splitting up regions across multiple districts, is a good idea because it ensures that the people elected from those districts will actually represent the region instead of the interests of another region that is partially located in the district. Another example is local government units, such as counties or municipalities, being communities of interest. Municipalities may have specific issues facing them, and in addition, keeping municipalities together makes it easier for people in those municipalities to know who their representatives are. And so many people would say that the more municipalities you can keep together, the better. Now that we've discussed the commissions that draw New Jersey's congressional and legislative districts, how and why these commissions produce gerrymandered maps, and what the alternatives to gerrymandering are, let's look at the redistrictings that occurred following the 2010 census as a case study to see all of these things in practice. We'll begin with the state legislative redistricting process, which is generally considered much more important by the two parties than the congressional redistricting process, because the former affects every member of both houses of the state legislature, whereas the latter only affects New Jersey's small share of one house of Congress. Following the 2010 census, the chairpeople of each party appointed members to the New Jersey Apportionment Commission, and the commissioners set to work trying to draw a map. As you would expect, the two sides could not come to an agreement prior to the deadline, so they had to get an independent member appointed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. What's interesting, however, is that the two sides could agree on who they wanted the independent member to be. The Chief Justice asked for the input of the two parties, and both sides recommended Alan Rosenthal, a professor of public policy from Rutgers University. You might ask why the two parties would be willing to agree on an independent member, rather than fighting for someone who would support their side. And I think the reason is, they know that if they were to fight for people who would brazenly benefit themselves, they would risk that the Chief Justice would pick someone benefiting the other party, whereas it's better for them to just agree on someone who's fair-minded and well-respected by both sides. Anyway, New Jersey Supreme Court Chief Justice Stuart Rabner agreed to appoint Alan Rosenthal, and the two sides promptly went back to working on their own gerrymandered maps. Occasionally, one side or the other would come to Rosenthal with their proposal, and he would send them away demanding tweaks or changes. At one point, the Bayshore Tea Party showed up and offered its own map, which was actually pretty good in the sense that it was based more on contiguousness and compactness, and keeping municipalities and counties together than it was on gerrymandering. Yet it also jeopardized a bunch of incumbents, so it more or less got ignored by the commission. As the deadline got closer, Alan Rosenthal had to make a final decision. The two parties presented their final maps to him. Rosenthal picked the Democratic map. His reasoning was essentially that the Democratic map preserved continuity of representation better than the Republican map. So you're not just throwing people into a different district with incumbents they've never heard of. However, it could be argued that in that particular year, this factor was inherently biased in favor of the Democrats because they had drawn the previous map as well. Now let's discuss some data about how this map has worked for the Democrats. In order to figure out how much this map benefits the Democrats, I decided to play with some election data. So I looked at the results from the 2013 and 2017 state Senate elections. And for each of those election cycles, I added up all of the votes that Democratic candidates received, and I added up all of the votes that Republican candidates received. I then added up the votes for the Democrats and Republicans, but excluded independents and third parties, to figure out the percentage of the vote that each party got. And from that, calculated the number of seats you would expect each party to win if the map was neutral. Then I compared that to the number of seats the parties actually won. This isn't a perfect system, of course, because it doesn't consider how specific candidates or campaigns affect the vote, but it does give a general sense of how gerrymandered the map is. So, 2013 was the year that Chris Christie won his second term in office, and it was a big Republican wave. Chris Christie won 19 of New Jersey's 21 counties, and Republicans got the majority of votes in state Senate elections. Specifically, Republican candidates got just over 51% of the vote. So based on this number, you would expect the Republicans to win 21 of the 40 state Senate seats. But that isn't what happened. Instead, Republicans only won 16 seats, while Democrats won 24. So in a year when Republican candidates won the majority of the vote, Democrats still came away with the majority of the seats. The primary reason for this is that due to the effective packing and cracking of Republicans by the Democrats, most of that elevated Republican turnout occurred either in packed districts that the Republicans were already guaranteed to win, or in cracked districts that the Republicans had a little chance of flipping. So gerrymandering essentially neutralized the benefits that a party would typically be expected to receive from turning out more voters. However, in 2017, the effects of gerrymandering weren't as pronounced, in large part because it was a year with high Democratic turnout, since incumbent Republican Governor Chris Christie was unpopular. Remember that was the year that Democratic Governor Phil Murphy was elected. So in that year, I estimate that you would expect Democrats to win 24 of the seats, while the Republicans would win 16, whereas in reality, Democrats won 25 of the seats, and the Republicans won 15. Now we'll move on to New Jersey's congressional districts. When you're looking at the maps that I have on screen during this discussion, note that what they show is either New Jersey's current or previous congressional map, overlaid on top of presidential election results from one of the elections during which that map was in use. The presidential election results are only meant to show, in general terms, which areas of New Jersey are red and blue, so don't worry about them too much beyond that. Before we discuss the districting that occurred following the 2010 census, we should briefly discuss the one that occurred following the 2000 census. That redistricting actually ended in a compromise between the two sides, when they agreed to protect the incumbents from both sides, which resulted in a map where Democrats were favored in 7 districts, and Republicans were favored in 6 districts. So, incumbents from both sides were preserved, Democrats had a slight advantage, reflecting their slight advantage statewide, and neither party was completely thrown under the bus since they both had a sizable number of districts. So, both parties were relatively happy. But it was unlikely that the 2011 redistricting, which resulted in our current congressional map, was going to end in compromise. New Jersey's population had not grown as fast as the rest of the United States population, so New Jersey was going to lose a congressional district. There could be no compromise about protecting all incumbents. At least one incumbent had to go, and which incumbent that would be became a redistricting bloodbath. Following the 2010 census, the appropriate people appointed members to the New Jersey Redistricting Commission, and the two parties agreed to select John Farmer Jr., the then Rutgers Newark Law School dean, as the tie-breaking member. As the two parties worked on their respective maps, Democrats were looking for options that would either put 2 Republicans into the same district, wiping out one of them, or that would put 1 Democrat and 1 Republican into a Democratic-leaning district, wiping out the Republican. Whereas the Republicans were looking at options that would put 2 Democrats into the same district, or that would put a Democrat and a Republican into a Republican-leaning district, thus wiping out a Democrat. There was some consideration of a compromise that would pit 1 Democrat and 1 Republican into a party-neutral district, allowing each party a chance to preserve all of its incumbents during an election, but this did not come to fruition. North Jersey had grown slower than the rest of the state, so it was generally agreed that the incumbent sacrifice should come from that region.
Ultimately, at the end of the redistricting for that year, John Farmer Jr. chose a Republican proposal, which shifted the hometown of Democratic incumbent Stephen Rothman from the 9th District into Republican-leaning District 5, held by Republican incumbent Scott Garrett.
Among the factors Farmer said he liked about the Republican map are that the districts are compact and contiguous, that they preserve communities of interest and reflect the state's diversity. At this point, Rothman knew that in order to stay in Congress, he would either have to run in a difficult general election against Scott Garrett, or move to a Democratic-leaning district and run in a difficult primary election against another incumbent.
Ultimately, Rothman decided to move back from District 5 into District 9, which now also included a Democratic incumbent, Bill Pascrell, who had been shifted there from the 8th District. Pascrell and Rothman ran against each other in the primary, Pascrell won, and Rothman lost his seat in Congress. The battle over which incumbent to sacrifice was the single biggest battle of that redistricting process, and it ended up shifting the balance of New Jersey's map from 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans to 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans.
Having the districts go 50-50 is a slight advantage to the Republicans,
since New Jersey generally has a blue lean.
Yet the advantage isn't particularly extreme,
especially when compared to the much more extreme Democratic advantage in the state legislature.
Remember how we analyzed voting data from the 2013 and 2017 state Senate elections? I did the same thing with New Jersey's 2012, 2014, and 2016 congressional elections. In the 2012 election, I found that based on vote totals, you would expect Democrats to win 7 seats and Republicans to win 5, but instead they both won 6. So it's only a 1-seat deviation from what you would expect. Then in 2014, which was a Republican wave midterm election,
based on vote totals,
you would actually expect Republicans to win half and Democrats to win half, which is what happened. Lastly, in 2016, I calculated that you would expect Democrats to win 7 seats and Republicans to win 5. And surprisingly, despite the fact that half of the congressional districts have a built-in Republican advantage, Democrats actually succeeded in winning 7 seats because they ran a particularly strong and moderate candidate in District 5
who was able to oust Scott Garrett. This is somewhat ironic considering Stephen Rothman's decision to leave District 5 for District 9, and suggests that perhaps District 5 was actually more competitive than the parties realized at the time it was drawn.
So, just like 2014, 2016 actually did result in the number of seats you would expect going for each party. You can see that even though the map has a built-in Republican advantage overall, the advantage is relatively small, and is in fact small enough that when Democrats do particularly well, they can overcome it.
Now let's talk about some of the specific congressional districts and what went into their designs.
First of all, Districts 1, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 12 function as packed districts, where most of New Jersey's Democrats are packed in with each other. By contrast, Districts 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 11 function as cracked districts, which have mostly Republicans, but some excess Democrats cracked between them. As an example of packing and cracking, look at Districts 1 and 3. Under the previous map, District 3 included a big Democratic town in South Jersey called Cherry Hill. Even though the district leaned red, Cherry Hill had helped make it more competitive for the Democrats, and a Democrat even succeeded at flipping the district for one term before the Republicans got it back. When the Republicans drew the map following the 2010 census, they moved Cherry Hill from District 3 into District 1, making District 1 function more like a packed district, and District 3 function more like a cracked district, where it would be harder for the few remaining Democratic areas in District 3 to flip the seat.
To conclude this video, I want to discuss some of the factors other than gerrymandering that influenced this map, including protecting incumbents and communities of interest. It seems to me, based on the map, that aside from the one incumbent who had to go because the state lost a district, the mapmakers purposefully did not jeopardize any other incumbents. Even Democrat Frank Pallone in District 6, who lives on the long arm stretching to the east of his district, and who easily could have been shifted to District 4 in order to make District 6 more compact, was allowed to keep his seat. Perhaps the mapmakers left the rest of the incumbents safe in order to appeal to John Farmer Jr., perhaps they did so to try to build up seniority in the state's congressional delegation, or perhaps they did so for other reasons. But regardless, it seems to me that protecting the rest of the incumbents was part of the calculus with this map. Now, some other things I want to mention about this map are Districts 8 and 10. Earlier, I said that Districts 8 and 10 function as packed districts, but this doesn't mean that packing Democrats together was the reason they were designed that way. See, those are really districts based on communities of interest. District 10 is designed to keep together North Jersey's African American community, whereas District 8 is designed to keep together North Jersey's Latino community, and ensure that those communities can elect representatives they like. Keeping together those particular racial and ethnic communities of interest has also meant that those are the districts of New Jersey that do some of the worst jobs at keeping municipalities together, because cities such as Newark and Jersey City both have some African American areas and some Latino areas. Some of each city is within both districts. And keeping those communities together is also why those districts have some of the strangest and least compact shapes in the state. Now, another example of communities of interest that I want to point out in this map is District 3, though this is an example where communities of interest got thrown under the bus rather than protected. See, during the public comments period for this redistricting, some of the residents of South Jersey showed up and complained about how the district lobs together different communities of interest. Specifically, how it combines part of the Philadelphia suburbs community of interest in the west with the Jersey Shore community of interest in the east. And if you think about it, these communities do have fairly different political issues facing them. For instance, in the Philadelphia suburbs, unions are considered very important, and there are fewer small businesses than on the shore. The shore also has many more retirees than the Philadelphia suburbs, and is still facing greater difficulties recovering from Hurricane Sandy. Alas, despite the fact that these communities have distinct interests, the Redistricting Commission did not separate out these communities into different districts. Well, that's all for today's video. I hope you learned something you didn't know about districting and gerrymandering in New Jersey. The next video in this series will be about municipal government in New Jersey. So if you want to know when that video is released, hit the alarm icon and subscribe. Have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.